I seem to spend a lot of my time with either retro games or indie games, so a lot of mainstream gaming news just doesn't come my way, heaven forbid. So I was surprised when YouTube recommended me a video by GameSpot called How Team Asobi Accidentally Made the New Face of PlayStation. That title left a lot of questions in my head, such as 1. Who is Team Asobi? 2. What is this generic robot thing that looks like a toy from 2006? And 3. Do people still fanboy over consoles? So to find my answers on this supposed Sony mascot, I took to Google. Safe search, always off. Where I discovered Team Asobi used to be a small studio within the legendary Japan studio, before a series of typical Sony business decisions led to Team Asobi being the last studio standing. They must have an amazing catalog to withstand not only Japan's studio closing around them, but then to be given the resources from the closed studio by Sony. So what are the games that they have released? There is the Playroom in 2013, the Playroom VR in 2016, Astro Bot Rescue Mission in 2018, there's Astro's Playroom in 2020, and of course, most recently, Astro Bot. Now, I wouldn't call that collection of games anything special. I mean, to me, it's practically shovelware. But it's not exactly like Japan Studio was pumping out the hits at the end, right? Actually, if I'm being fair, I'll admit I'm slightly biased, as Japan Studio worked on some of my all-time favorite games from my youth. So it's a shame to hear they closed down such a legendary gaming studio to supplement something like Astro Bot, even if, realistically, their game releases were starting to look weaker towards the end. Anyways, I wanted to check out some gameplay to see what kind of game was going to represent Sony's new mascot against the likes of Nintendo's Mario or Xbox's Phil Spencer, and it seemed like a pretty polished puzzle platformer from what I saw. But the longer I watched, the more I was unimpressed with its lack of doing anything different, which was not nearly as disappointing as all of the PlayStation ball sucking I saw in the game. Flipping through the gameplay, I saw a scene where Astro Bot was dressed up as Spike from Ape Escape, battling a boss dressed as Spectre. I saw a bunch of NPCs in the background dressed like Parappa the Rapper. Then at one point, Astro Bot is dressed like Nathan Drake climbing vines and whatnot. That's when it clicked for me. This isn't anything new. This is just the PS5 version of Little Big Planet for the PS3, starting with your blank slate main character who dresses up as bigger PlayStation hits and does platforming. You got multiple videos and articles talking about Astro Bot and how it's going to be such a big boost for Sony. That seems like a whole lot of nothing when this isn't anything new, like I mentioned. Sackboy moved the needle for Sony back in the day a bit, sure, but in the end they left him in the dust when they realized he had no personality of his own to milk. And that's exactly what I feel is going to happen here. So, with my opinion made, as wrong or right as it may turn out to be, back under my rock I go to get back to games I truly enjoy. However, when I was doing my research for Astro Bot, it vaguely reminded me of other times where certain games or franchises were unfairly compared to other ones. And so wanting to remind myself of those ones, I went digging for them. And when I did, I discovered a couple of new ones. So for the enjoyment of everyone here, let's take a look at some of the best examples of games being unfairly compared to others. One of the most popular examples of an unfair gaming comparison is of course Blinx the Cat, when the Xbox official magazine told Mario and Sonic to prepare for war. This was published in July 2002, when Sonic was in the middle of its Sonic Advance series for the Game Boy Advance, as well as just finished celebrating its 10th anniversary with Sonic Adventures 2. Meanwhile, Mario recently appeared in Game & Watch Gallery Advance, Super Mario Advance 3 Yoshi's Island, Super Mario Sunshine, and Mario Party 4. During that same window, Blinx the Cat would appear in 2002's Blinx the Time Sweeper, and once more in 2004's Blinx 2 Masters of Time and Space. Here's a comparison of the offerings all three characters made during those 3 years of 2002 to 2004. Oh yeah, Blinx really took them to war for sure. I mean, Nintendo don't want none of that business. But you know what? I want to point out something I think gets lost in the sauce when this topic is discussed. Blinx's developer Artoon, as well as Microsoft themselves even, are not actually to blame. I mean, they didn't make the comparison. Xbox official magazine was the one making that comparison. Every time this comparison is discussed online, you'll see endless people making fun of the game Blinks the Cat or the developers or whatever, and that's just not how it should be. Making fun of the game or its developers is not the reaction one should have in this situation. I say good for Artoon for releasing 2 decently received games. I mean, that's a hard thing to do even nowadays. Shit, apparently it's a hard thing for companies to even make one decent game anymore, regardless of development, time, or budget. Let's stick with Microsoft for a bit. As much like your first friend to grow pubes, they like making a lot of comparisons. Starting with one of the most compared to franchises in gaming history. That, of course, being Halo and the plethora of Halo killers that have come and gone over the years. Something I was surprised to learn about during my research was that the first noted use of the term Halo killer came from within Infinity Ward as around 2007. It was used as a codename for a since unreleased project that was supposed to combine the gameplay of Call of Duty 2 with a sci-fi setting. As mentioned though, it was never released, as Infinity Ward wanted to channel all available resources into Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. This actually ended up being the best move, as Call of Duty 4 would go on to outsell Halo 3 anyway, thus technically accomplishing their goal in a very roundabout sort of way. Our next Halo killer actually predates the story from Infinity Ward, as most do, and that is Warhammer 40k's Fire Warrior. Released in 2003 between Halo Combat Evolved and Halo 2, the powers that be had decided to run advertising that featured a quote from Play magazine saying, "Who needs Halo?" in a font that's pretty much as big as the game's logo. So while it's true the quote came from Play magazine and thus they should be blamed for it, Play magazine weren't the ones creating the advertising for Fire Warrior. So shame on Kuju Entertainment for going with it. And yes, while there have been many Warhammer games since then, that is in no way thanks to the performance of Fire Warrior. I mean, not a very good performance for the very first of the Halo killers now, is it? Chronologically, the next Halo killer was the PlayStation exclusive Killzone. Now this is another Blinks the Cat situation, as in none of the advertising for Killzone does it mention Halo at all. Meaning all of the Halo killer stuff had to come from the media itself, kind of like with Blinks. The big difference between Killzone and Blinks the Timesweeper is that Killzone would go on to have strong sales, although not even remotely close to the sales of Halo 2, and would go on to release 6 games across a decade. So while not a Halo killer in any sort of way, still a totally noteworthy and successful game franchise. A fun fact I dug up while trying to find Killzone calling itself a Halo killer was that it was apparently Sony themselves who were big into advertising Killzone in that way, and the media ran with it. Kinda like when Sony overhyped No Man's Sky, or like when Sony overhyped Cyberpunk 2077, 2 famous examples of games that needed just more time in the oven. Anyway, multiple members from the developer Guerrilla Games have stated that they never intended or wanted to be compared to Halo, and they only wanted to create a good game. More victims of the gaming hype machine. The gaming hype machine was in full swing with our next Halo killer, but this time it was the producers holding the gas pedal, and that is with the fairly infamous Advent Rising. Now, Advent Rising has since become known for many different things, such as advertising a $1 million contest that they didn't pay out in the end due to various reasons depending on who you choose to believe, Tommy Tallarico reviewing it highly without disclosing that he and his team actually worked on the game, claims of plagiarism in the writing, as well as just a general lackluster gameplay. Swimming through the sea of all that horseshit though, I once again cannot find any examples of the developer Glyph X comparing themselves to Halo. Yes, they were definitely hyping their game up, extremely so, but they were far more focused on their $1 million prize and saying their game is just the greatest period than worrying specifically about Halo. So we have another case here of the media being the ones responsible for putting the game in an unfavorable comparison, at least with Halo. They're not responsible for, unfortunately, all the other negative comparisons. Beyond that, there are probably close to over 100 videos discussing the disaster of Advent Rising, so we'll just move along. One of the most popular games mentioned when discussing Halo killers, and one of the games that suffered worse from their unfair comparison, was 2008's Haze. This was Free Radical's attempt at making a futuristic shooter that dealt with topics such as addiction and PTSD, all while still being kind of, tongue-in-cheek, Starship Troopers kind of funny. Or at least that was the plan, which sounds like it could potentially be great. I mean, Free Radical was the right people for the job. They're the ones who made Time Splitters. For those who have never played a Time Splitter game for whatever reason, I heavily recommend Time Splitters Future Perfect, a game I consider to be one of the most perfect multiplayer shooter games ever made. But anyway, enough about good games, back to Haze. Not only was Haze a victim of the media hyping up as a Halo killer, but also its publisher Ubisoft, who was willing to overhype the game for the potential sales regardless of any potential disappointment it may cause later on. And disappointment is exactly what people got, as Haze suffered from not only a short campaign that was considered weak in writing, had lackluster gameplay controls, and even the stuff that was good couldn't compete with the expectations set by Ubisoft and the media. For another example of how bad it was, Haze was another one of those games from that time period that had Korn write an intro song for them. Make sure you Google it, it's a treat. But absolute worst of all, Haze's poor reception led to Free Radical closing down, with not even the promise of a fourth Time Splitters game being enough to entice any publishers to invest in the team going forward. And that's it for Halo Killers. I mean, there are more, but I don't need another long rambly video that no one's going to watch. Anyway, I want to move on to some non-Halo stuff now. But then I got looking back at other covers from the official Xbox magazine, and literally on the issue before the Blinks the Cat one, they make their own Halo comparison. This issue's cover claims that the newest squad shooter Brute Force was shaping up to be the next Halo, and while sure, Brute Force was received positively, I don't think that these two games are similar enough to even be compared. It's more that the media, Xbox official magazine in this instance, knows that these kind of quotes and headlines will generate attention. I mean, on the same cover as the Brute Force comparison is a quote about how Peter Molyneux's new RPG is gonna show Final Fantasy who the best RPG is. Hey, shit, Xbox magazine. Quit serving all this beef up each month, huh? Now, this issue was released in June 2002. The next RPG released by Peter Molyneux wouldn't come for 2 more years until Fable was released in 2004, which admittedly was a solid game, Peter Molyneux overhyping and disappointments aside, such as having kids or watching trees grow. However, in June 2002, the most recently released Final Fantasy was Final Fantasy X, which, even when I put my own personal bias aside, is considered one of the best Final Fantasy games made. Unfortunately, I can't find any scans of the insides of these magazines, so I can't read the articles for myself. But even then, I'm choosing to believe it's just made up media hype. I mean, Peter Molyneux has always been very favorable to the Final Fantasy franchise, even going so far as to say that Final Fantasy VII is the definitive RPG experience. And that wasn't the only time Xbox official magazine took a shot at Final Fantasy. I guess they were salty about not getting a Final Fantasy game onto Xbox until 7 years later with Final Fantasy 13. Unless you want to include Final Fantasy 11, which I never do. So here we are after just 3 official Xbox magazine covers, and we have 4 bad comparisons. I wonder how many more we can find if we just flip through a couple more issues. Turns out the answer's a lot. 1 month after their premiere volume claims Dead or Alive 3 as the newest face of all fighting games, Volume 2's cover says that there's a new fighter in town, better than Dead or Alive 3. Now, I don't recognize that picture from anything in particular, so I tried to look up different fighting games released around that time, and all my research has led me to believe is that they were talking about the Fight Club video game. And now, the first rule of Fight Club is that there's absolutely no fucking reason to discuss the Fight Club video game, so let's move on. Going back to what I said about being salty that certain game franchises are not on the Xbox, the Xbox official magazine would go hard after Grand Theft Auto with its comparison to True Crime. Now, this is a tough one to talk about, as True Crime Streets of LA really did have some good stuff going for it at the time. And of course, Grand Theft Auto did as well. But just sticking to the facts, in issue 11 of the Xbox official magazine, we see on the cover the quote, "Better than Grand Theft Auto 3? True. True crime. See the evidence on page 19. I swear it says that. You just gotta try and ignore Christie's lewd body from Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball. You'll see it. Much easier to spot 6 months later is the giant Eastern European dude absolutely raw dogging some Italian pimp. As the magazine writes, who needs Grand Theft Auto? True crime's bigger, better, and badder. This time taking a shot at Grand Theft Auto Vice City. And for lack of good grammar, True Crime was a badder game compared to Grand Theft Auto. That is to say, it just wasn't as good. Anyway, we'll stop there with the Xbox official magazine and Microsoft and Halo Killers and all that good stuff. I mean, we could just keep reading magazines and picking out terrible comparisons. We could do with Sony even. You know, speaking of my favoriteest RPG ever made, let's head on over to the Sony magazine for a sec. We take a look at the PlayStation magazine, which is another console-specific gaming magazine published by Future Network, who are the same people behind the Xbox official magazine. Funnily enough, Future Network still has over 20 media outlets operating to this day, including Games Radar Plus and PC Gamer, as well as a whole bunch more. Anyway, back to that December 2000 issue of PlayStation Magazine, where we have some really excellent art of Tone from Dark Cloud, with the very unfortunate caption of Zelda Killer? Which is not even saying that it is a Zelda killer, more just asking if it has the potential to be one. But oh well, now everyone who likes the Zelda franchise spits in the direction of Dark Cloud, and will more than likely refuse to give it a fair chance. If for some extremely off-chance reason you're watching this and have never played Dark Cloud, I'd highly recommend it as an excellent city building / dungeon crawling RPG. I just don't want people hating on Dark Cloud or its developers level 5 for a shitty comparison that they didn't make. Once again, it's the media that made that terrible comparison, but it's going to be the game that has to suffer the consequences. Thank goodness, Future Network never published a Nintendo magazine. Okay, well they did publish Nintendo Power, but that's not the Nintendo magazine I'm sloppily alluding to. The one I'm talking about is Nintendo Official Magazine, when it wrote on the cover, "Move Over Mario," in regards to the game 40 Winks. But this time, I can't solely blame the media for a shitty comparison, as Eurocom Entertainment Software actually went ahead and put the quote dead center on the actual fucking box of their game. So every time you flip through your games, you were reminded that this game claimed to be superior to any Mario game you were thinking of playing at that time. Pretty bold of a Nintendo-affiliated magazine to put down the biggest Nintendo mascot in the name of some attention. Pretty bold of Eurocom for putting a shitty quote on the cover of their box for attention. Pretty dumb for both for trading in all that credibility for just a little bit more attention. But the story doesn't just stop there for 40 Winks, as ironically the game would be cancelled before its release onto Nintendo 64. Thus, it would only be released onto PlayStation, where Eurocom still decided to put that awful quote on the game's cover. But you Nintendo diehards need not worry. If you want to play a game on your Nintendo 64 that was reportedly better than any of Mario's bullshit, 40 Winks was successfully released for the N64 via crowdfunding in 2019. I'm not quite sure where you can grab a copy, but if it's like any other N64 game, I'm sure you can find it on eBay for a couple $100. Let's take a look at one more game company that made their own terrible comparison without the help of any games media, and then we can move on to our final point and start bringing it all together. Now, Grand Theft Auto V was released all the way back in 2013 and has been a record-making revenue earner and long-lasting cultural phenomena via the Grand Theft Auto Online ever since. Earlier on in this video, we already discussed how Ubisoft has no qualms about making comparisons to bigger game franchises if it means potentially better sales. So, it should be no surprise when 4 years after the release of Grand Theft Auto V, Ubisoft decided to take some shots at GTA in the advertising of their newest game, Watch Dogs. Now, a lot of people still argue the comparisons of these two games all over the internet, claiming one is better for this reason, or the other is better for that reason. In the end, GTA 5 has made about $9 billion alone, is reviewed positively by critics and public alike, and has single-handedly ruined a generation of kids into thinking they're little gangbangers. Meanwhile, Watch Dogs only conjures to mind a bunch of gameplay bugs. So essentially, fuck Ubisoft. Anyways, watch as I bend this sumbitch full circle harder than any games journalist ever bent the truth in their life. As we've seen in the examples I was able to dig up in a single night of drunken Google, a vast majority of these comparisons were made not from the game developers, but from outside sources, such as mainly games journalists, but also even sometimes corporate entities. And by no means is this an old phenomenon. I mean, let's take a look at another piece of recent gaming news with Sony's Concord. Now, for those who don't know, because it came and went so quickly, Concord was another hero shooter that we all knew was going to fail. Regardless of its over 8 years of development and bloated development budget, which even forced other games to be cancelled in its wake, like a new Infamous sequel. All for its servers to be shut down and it pulled from retailers after just 15 days. And even then, this terrible, awful game that anyone could tell within seconds was going to be a terrible, awful game was still able to convince some critics to speak their bullshit, such as Jeuxvideo.com, a French-exclusive gaming news website. They would go on to write some conneries françaises that translates to Concord is a very good hero shooter that could very well overshadow the big names in the genre, which may not be as inflammatory as telling Overwatch to put on a clean pair of underwear because Concord's coming home after a long night of drinking. But with just how lame Concord was, comes off as just as shitty of a comment. Now, I had a very different ending for this video, but halfway through writing the script, Sony made the news again with an announcement discussing how the Sony CEO Kenichiro Yoshida sees Astro Bot as a key Sony franchise moving forward, even noting its higher launch week sales than Sonic Frontiers or Crash Bandicoot 4. We've just gotten into fall season, and already multiple media outlets are calling Astro Bot the game of the year. So power to Team Asobi and even Sony, I guess. With Sonic and Crash already down, that leaves only a handful more mascots standing in their way. I wish them luck with their little bot planet looking ass game, and maybe years from now we'll all think of Astro Bot as one of the great Sony mascots that has spent so much time referencing, along with the likes of Spyro the Dragon, Ratchet, Lara Croft's Pointy Titties, Polygon Man, and all the rest of the freaks that anyone under the age of 25 would struggle to name. In closing, there isn't really much to say. Basically, I'm kind of sick of Sony trying to make something out of nothing every 2 minutes, whether it's a new mascot or a new game. We got to discuss bad game comparisons, which is fun for me. I always enjoy that stuff. Hopefully it was fun for you. It turns out the real Halo killer was 343 Industries. If you hear that some game is taking a shot at another, actually stop and make sure where that news is coming from. If it's just a journalist looking for attention, or is a developer maybe or maybe not off their rocker. RIP Japan Studios. Go play Dark Cloud. Please like and subscribe, as not only does it help the channel grow more, it keeps me growing more too as a creator. And of course, leave a comment or opinion or whatever down below. I always try and respond to them, at least the ones worth responding to. I do appreciate all that stuff. Any interaction is always going to be a huge thing for me, of course. So I thank you for that. I hope you enjoyed this one. Please look forward to the next one, whatever it may be. It will be a while. I'm kind of in a weird living situation right now where I can't pump out videos once a month like I may have tried to at the start. But I am always working on it. Progress is always happening, even if it doesn't seem it. I try and upload shorts and stuff in the meantime. Anyway, it's going to turn into another rambly ending, and I'm trying to fix that. So, till then, have a good one. See you next time. Later.